In the Vietnam orthodoxy, General Paul Hawkins, Thomas McVie from 1962 to 1964, is often characterised as a fantasist, imagining military progress in South Vietnam in 1963. Misled by false reports from Saigon, he was ignorant of the true nature of the situation in the countryside. But Hawkins was not the indolent and feckless general officer the orthodoxy imagines, and he was not alone in his positive view of the military situation in South Vietnam. The war did not only have a military aspect, however, and it was the political rather than the military that concerned Washington in 1963. It was this dichotomy between the military and political that left Washington divided between the Defense and State Departments. This division would climax in November with an attempt not to reverse a losing military position, but to correct a troublesome political situation. Thompson visits Washington. The head of the British advisory mission to Vietnam, Robert K. Thompson, visited Washington in late March and early April 1963. He had spent 10 months in Vietnam, and in meetings with senior figures in the US administration, he maintained real progress had been made in the Strategic Hamlet Program. By the middle of 1964, the Saigon government would have sufficient control of the countryside to deny the Viet Cong access to the population. Thompson also stated that without Diem, South Vietnam would be at risk of losing the war within 6 months. Defense and State divided. During an executive committee conference on the morning of September 6, Attorney General Robert Kennedy asked whether the war could be won with New and Diem. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, having already referred to the deterioration in the relationship with the Diem government, replied that the war could not be won if New and his wife continued their present activities. Kennedy then asked, "If we are going to lose with Diem, why do we not grasp the nettle now?" General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, pointed out that 3 weeks earlier it was agreed that the war could be won with Diem, and asked whether recent events, the Buddhist crisis, had changed the consensus. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara suggested that Washington did not have enough intelligence on the situation in South Vietnam. When Kennedy asked whether it was possible to obtain the views of US advisors serving with South Vietnamese military units, Taylor suggested that Marine Major General Victor A. Krulak, Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, visit Vietnam to gain the views of US and South Vietnamese officers. Roger Hilsman, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, asserted that Joseph A. Mendenhall, a Foreign Service officer, accompanied Krulak as the State Department representative. No conclusion had been reached, but there was agreement on the need for more information, and President Kennedy subsequently approved the 4-day Krulak-Mendenhall visit. As Mendenhall believed the Buddhist problem was most severe in the central coastal provinces, he visited Hue and Da Nang as well as Saigon, while Krulak conducted 87 field interviews in all 4 core areas. Krulak's report was similar to a periodic inspection report he had made in July. He had observed that positive progress was being made, putting the Viet Cong on the defensive, although the VC remained strong in the Mekong Delta. The ARVN had begun the operational phase of the National Campaign Plan, and it was conducting 1,000 offensive operations each month. Krulak acknowledged the strain the Buddhist crisis was having on the government, but he had found little indication of wider impact, and he further observed that the true percentage of practicing Buddhists is smaller than generally represented. Like most of the American military, Krulak supported Diem because only Diem was strong enough to provide the stability South Vietnam required, and he believed ARVN dissatisfaction was limited to No Ding New. The same country. On September 10th, Krulak and Mendenhall attended a 10:30 Executive Committee meeting with President Kennedy. Krulak presented his report. It was necessary, he believed, to continue current military and sociological programs despite grave defects in the ruling regime. Mendenhall was pessimistic. He had found a pervasive atmosphere of fear and hate of the Diem regime in the cities he visited, and he stated that the Viet Cong had made recent advances in the northern coastal sector of the country. In fact, a later official NVA history of the 1963 Spring Offensive in northern South Vietnam would later admit that the achievements of our combat operations were limited. Mendenhall concluded that the war could not be won while New remained in South Vietnam. This was a stark contrast in opinions, and Kennedy joked, "The two of you did visit the same country, didn't you?" General Krulak explained that Mendenhall had presented an urban perspective, while his was from a national viewpoint. Rufus Phillips, Assistant Director of the US Operations Mission for Rural Affairs, argued that US military advisors were not in a position to give a credible account of political attitudes, and that while the war may have been going well in the Free Northern Corps sectors, the Viet Cong was tearing apart the strategic Hamlet program in the Mekong Delta. The battle, Krulak interrupted, was not being lost in a military sense, but Rufus replied that it was not a military but a political war. Concluding the meeting, President Kennedy stated that the aim of the administration was to use cuts in assistance programs to put pressure on Diem. Conclusion. To understand the position in South Vietnam in 1963, it's important to first acknowledge the dichotomy between the military and the political, because that dichotomy shaped the position of the Defense and State Departments. The perception in Washington was that while the military position in South Vietnam was positive, the political situation was breaking down. The long-term breakdown of the political situation is debatable, but it's this perception that drove the November coup and the murder of Ngo Dinh Diem. And as Robert K. Thompson had stated with some prescience in April, without Diem, South Vietnam would indeed be at risk of losing the war within 6 months.